afternoon, everyone. Going into a really important meeting, another important moment in this long, sad series of meetings about the devastating situation in Ukraine. Secretary General obviously back with us after a really important trip last week to Kiev and Moscow. First opportunity we have to hear from him directly about what he learned there, what he said there. I just wanted to point out from Ireland's point of view that we stand full square with the Secretary-General, all that he's doing to help from day one, as he said, bring this war to an end, calling it out for what it is, a deplorable breach of international law and of the Charter. And we certainly are fully in support of what his immediate duty and his obligations and responsibilities were on the ground to try and save human life. That trumps everything as far as I'm concerned, that we have a Secretary General who can get there, speak to people who are in a position to help save lives. Today, I'm looking forward very much to hearing from Michelle Bachelet also, from Martin Griffiths, because the ongoing work on humanitarian corridors, on saving lives and getting people safely to where they want to go. That's something we expect to hear more of from OCHA, from Martin Griffiths today, and of course a voice from civil society, from the ordinary people who are, the civilians are bearing the brunt of this war. Civilians, of course, the least responsible for the situation they're in, so we're looking forward to hearing from them. You're welcome.
Thank you. Hello. I will make a statement there. Just good afternoon. We have entered the third month of this war waged by Russia against Ukraine. For over 2 months, the Russian army has been killing civilians. This is a human and humanitarian disaster. Once again, the priority is to put an end to this and to get back to the full respect of international law. Humanitarian access must be urgently guaranteed in Mariupol and all besieged cities, and France condemns the continued shelling of these cities. I commend the efforts by the Secretary General and its teams in order to push for a ceasefire, as well as their action to save and protect civilians. I'm looking forward to listening to his debrief of his visit on the field. France, together with the European Union, will continue to stand by the Ukrainian people, providing military, humanitarian, and economic support. We are committed to the fight against impunity, together with the International Criminal Court. Our overall support to Ukraine will increase to $2 billion, as announced today by President Macron. There are also talks about a new set of sanctions in Brussels in order to continue to put pressure on Russia. Russia knows now that it is isolated and it must stop this war now. Thank you.
Ambassador, any questions? You think this leads to a ceasefire at all?
Good afternoon. The 9,027th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of the Council, Ambassador Barbara Woodward, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom, for her service as President of the Council for the month of April. I would like to express the Council's appreciation to Ambassador Woodward and her team for the skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. Thank you, Barbara. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Greece, Italy, Latvia, Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency, Mr. Piotr Gliński, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Culture and National Heritage of Poland. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Ms. Tatiana Luzan, Advocacy Coordinator, Right to Protection. It is so decided. Mr. Griffiths, Ms. Bachelet, and Ms. Luzan are joining today's meeting via video teleconference. The Secretary General will now begin its the Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 on the agenda. And I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, I welcome this opportunity to address the Security Council on my recent visit to the Russian Federation and Ukraine, where I met with President Putin and President Zelensky on the 26th and the 28th of April, respectively. As part of my regional visit, I also had discussions with President Erdogan in Ankara and President Duda in Rzeszów, Poland. Throughout my travels, I did not mince words. I said the same thing in Moscow as I did in Kyiv, which is exactly what I have repeatedly expressed in New York, namely that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and of the Charter of the United Nations, and that it must end for the sake of the people of Ukraine, Russia, and the entire world. Madam President, I visited Moscow and Kyiv with a clear understanding of the realities on the ground. I entered an active war zone in Ukraine with no immediate possibility of a national ceasefire and a full-scale ongoing attack on the east of the country. Before the visit, the Ukrainian government issued an appeal to the United Nations and to me personally, expressed publicly by the Deputy Prime Minister, regarding the dire plight of civilians in the devastated city of Mariupol and specifically the Azovstal plant. In my meeting with President Putin, I therefore stressed the imperative enabling humanitarian access and evacuations from besieged areas, including first and foremost Mariupol. I strongly urged the opening of a safe and effective humanitarian corridor to allow civilians to reach safety from the Azovstal plant. A short time later, I received confirmation of an agreement in principle. We immediately followed up with intense preparatory work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, along with Russian and Ukrainian authorities. Our objective was to initially enable the safe evacuation of those civilians from the Azovstal plant, and later the rest of the city, in any direction they choose, and to deliver humanitarian aid. I am pleased to report on some measure of success. Together, the United Nations and the ICRC are leading a humanitarian operation of great complexity, both politically and in terms of security. It began on 29 April and has required enormous coordination and advocacy with the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian authorities. So far, 2 safe passage convoys have been successfully completed. In the first, concluded on 3 May, 101 civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal plant, along with 59 more from a neighboring area. In the second operation, completed last night, more than 320 civilians were evacuated from the city of Mariupol and surrounding areas. A third operation is underway, but it is our policy not to speak about the details of any of them before they are completed, to avoid undermining possible success. It is good to know that even in these times of hyper-communications, silent diplomacy is still possible and is sometimes the only effective way to produce results. So far in total, nearly 500 civilians found long-awaited relief after living under relentless shelling and scarce availability of water, food, and sanitation. The evacuees have shared moving tales with UN staff. Mothers, children, and frail grandparents spoke of their trauma. Some were in urgent need of medical attention. I hope that the continued coordination with Moscow and Kyiv will lead to more humanitarian pauses to allow civilians safe passage from the fighting and aid to reach those in critical need. We must continue to do all we can to get people out of these hellscapes. And the Secretary General and the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffith, will brief you today in greater detail on the latest efforts in Mariupol and additional steps. Commissioner Bachelet will brief on reports of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, possible war crimes, and the need for accountability. As I discussed yesterday with President Zelensky, the UN will continue to scale up humanitarian operations, save lives, and reduce suffering. Madam President, my meetings with both leaders also focused on the crucial issue of global food security. And indeed, the worldwide implications of this war were in full view in my subsequent travels to West Africa. In Senegal, Niger, and Nigeria, I heard direct testimony from leaders and civil society on how the war is unleashing a food security crisis. We need quick and decisive action to ensure a steady flow of food and energy in open markets by lifting export restrictions, allocating surpluses and reserves to those who need them, and addressing food price increase to calm market volatility. But let me be clear, a meaningful solution to global food insecurity requires reintegrating Ukraine's agricultural production and the food and fertilizer production of Russia and Belarus into world markets despite the war. I will do my best to help facilitate a dialogue to help make this a reality. At the same time, the war in Ukraine in all its dimensions is setting in motion a crisis that is also devastating global energy markets, disrupting financial systems, and exacerbating extreme vulnerabilities for the developing world. That is precisely why I established the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance to mobilize UN agencies, multilateral development banks, and other international institutions to help countries face these challenges. We were particularly engaged in making proposals at the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Madam President, Excellencies, the war on Ukraine is senseless in scope, restless in its dimensions, and limitless in its potential for global harm. The cycle of death, destruction, dislocation, and disruption must stop. It is high time to unite and end this war and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Linda, Madam President, thank you very much indeed. As we've just heard from the Secretary General, elements of diplomatic progress are coming into view even as civilian suffering mounts. So I'll speak briefly today, if I may, about the human toll of this war, and then about what we're doing to address humanitarian needs, including a short update on our latest operations. And I know that High Commissioner Bachelet will, of course, detail the impact on civilians for you, so I will be brief. Just to recap, the destruction of civilian infrastructure has come to characterize this conflict. Apartment buildings, schools, and hospitals in populated areas have been attacked, and they must not be so. Over 13 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, of whom 7.7 million are displaced inside Ukraine. Lives have been uprooted, ripped apart, and never will be the same again. And many others couldn't run. Often the most vulnerable are simply stuck. The elderly, people with disabilities have been unable to seek shelter from bombs, get out to gather supplies, or receive information on evacuations. And the threat of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and human trafficking, as I'm sure we will hear from the other briefers, risen hugely since the war began. Allegations of sexual violence against women, girls, men, and boys are mounting. Roads, as we've all seen, are heavily contaminated with explosive ordnance, putting civilians at risk and stopping humanitarian convoys from reaching them. Madam President, let me briefly brief you on what the UN and our humanitarian partners are trying to do inside Ukraine to meet these growing needs. We have now 217 humanitarian partners with whom we are working in Ukraine. And I think we have now scaled up at record speed. We have more than 1,400 staff, UN staff, deployed across the country, operating out of 8 hubs beyond Kyiv, with staff, warehouses, and supplies in 30 locations, principally, of course, across the east, where the war is happening and the needs are greatest. We reach more than 4.1 million people with some form of assistance on a daily basis across all the country's 24 oblasts. Our humanitarian response has 3 main aspects. First, we deliver a great deal of humanitarian assistance and protection services to displaced people, and I know it's not enough, and I'm sure it's adequate, and I know we'll hear more on that. But that's all across the country, especially where internally displaced people have sought safety, or where people have begun returning, a crucial new element, to severely damaged communities. And when I was in Irpin just a few weeks ago, the mayor was describing to us, as he, I think, described to the Secretary General, how his people are trying to get back to Irpin, but to do so, the reconstruction will take, as he's put it, a year and a half. So restoring basic services necessary to survival is key. And I was very struck by the fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross very, very quickly after the conversation I'd had, but not as a result of that, went in to repair the basic services element for the population of Irpin to be able to return. In these areas, injecting cash aid allows civilians to choose what they need and offers a modicum of dignity in these fractious times. It helps to keep markets open and liquidity and supply chains moving. We plan to reach 1.3 million people with cash assistance, plugging into Ukraine's social protection system with top-up payments, working with the government, working with the Prime Minister and his plans for the distribution of cash to his people to reach family at risk. This is needed technically aid on, but it's now largely achieved. Cash-based aid will now scale up very, very quickly indeed. A second part, that's the first part. The second part of our response is working on pre-positioning supplies to forward operating bases and increasing our preparedness in areas to where we imagine this war might move next. And third, and we've heard from the Secretary General, we engage every single day with the conflict to push for the movement of aid to civilians in areas of active conflict or to negotiate to help civilians leave for safer areas. We have been able, Madam President, so far to stage 5 interagency aid convoys to some of the hardest hit areas, operations which required a humanitarian notification system to both parties to allow for those safe passage movements. They've been a lifeline, a small mercy perhaps, to civilians encircled by fighting, bringing in medical supplies, water, food rations, non-food items, and so forth. But it's a beginning, but hopefully it's not an end. And as the Secretary General has described, as a result of his own efforts, we've seen a glimmer of hope in these past days, thanks to his efforts and those of our colleagues on the front line. As you know, on May the 2nd, more than 100 civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, including women, children, and older people. About 60 more people joined that convoy on the outskirts of Mariupol and were then able to move to safety. And it was, as the Secretary General has described, a project of the greatest complexity and of constant oversight, and it was an exceptional operation. I'm especially grateful. I'd like to record here our thanks to the International Committee of the Red Cross and the leadership of Peter Maurer, as well as to our own highly experienced first responders. But I must also applaud the authorities and it's essentially the respective militaries of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation for their close and constructive and essential cooperation in making that operation a reality. It showed us that that can happen. And I believe, though the numbers weren't great, that a single life saved is worth every ounce of effort. And as of yesterday, as the Secretary General said, we were able to move more than 320 civilians out of the Mariupol area broadly, again working closely in lockstep with ICRC and with the cooperation of the Ukrainian and the Russian authorities. And today we have that third operation, which began this morning with the intent of evacuating civilians from Mariupol and Azovstal. And as he said, we prefer not to speak about that operation until it is complete. What I can finally say about this is we're seeing the fruits of our labor over these past many weeks of establishing a liaison in Moscow, of the visits that preceded the Secretary General and which were brought into fruition by his own long and detailed meetings with the leaderships of both sides in this last week. We are beginning to see now the agreement on local ceasefires, because none of these movements of safe passage will happen without local ceasefires, pauses, windows of silence. So we're making some progress, and we're building relations, and we're building experience, which we hope we can then broaden to more such operations. And that is the third element of our humanitarian program. We'll keep pushing for more civilians to be able to leave Mariupol and indeed Azovstal if they so choose. And we'll now begin on that basis to explore options for reaching others where the need is greatest and where we need and desire to serve the people of Ukraine in their hour of direst need. Madam President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Michelle Bachelet.
Madam President, Excellencies, for over 8 years, since 15 March 2014, my office through the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has been monitoring the situation in Ukraine. To date, we have released close to 50 periodic and thematic reports. On the 24th of February 2022, we quickly adapted to a very different working environment. Like millions of Ukrainians, the staff of my office relocated to other regions in the country, but, and I'm very proud to say, have not paused their work for a single day. Currently, the mission has staff on the ground in Uzhgorod, Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro, Donetsk, and Odessa, and conducts field visits to various parts of the country, including Kyiv and Chernihiv region just last week. The mission continues to verify allegations of violations of international human rights law and of international humanitarian law in the context of the Russian Federation's armed attack on Ukraine. Many of these allegations concern violations that may amount to war crimes. Based on the mission work, my office updated the UN Human Rights Council at the end of March and will present a report on the human rights situation in Ukraine covering the period from 24 February to 15 May, next session of the Council in June. And my press statement on Ukraine on the 22nd of April summarized our most recent findings. It pains me to say that all our concerns remain valid and the situation keeps deteriorating. Madam President, today is the 71st day of the escalation of the hostilities, expanding the already 8-year-long conflict to all regions of the country. Reports of deadly incidents, such as attacks on Hospital Number 3 and the Drama Theater in Mariupol, on the railway station in Kramatorsk, on residential areas in Odessa, have become shockingly frequent. There seems to be no end in sight to the daily reports of civilian death and injuries. My team on the ground conveys the palpable trauma and shock experienced by people they speak with, the vast majority of whom have either personally witnessed a violation or are victims themselves. Rather than try to describe what victims are going through, let me use their words. Residents of Mariupol set up a Telegram channel to share information about their relatives who perished in the city, and I will quote them. He was killed in front of his wife and children. Her body remained under the debris of her house. We could not even bury her. My uncle died from loss of blood after sustaining fragmentation injuries. I only know he was buried in a collective grave. I could share many more such messages. Last week, on the 28th of April, when the UN Secretary General was visiting Kyiv to meet the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the city was hit by 2 missiles. At least one woman, a journalist, was killed, and 4 civilians were injured in the attack. An OSCHR team was in Kyiv on that day too, preparing to visit Busha. On the same day, we corroborated 22 civilian deaths and 40 civilian injuries in other places of Ukraine. Members of the Council, in Ukraine, my office has recorded 6,731 civilian casualties since the 24th of February. We know the real figures are considerably higher. As my office consistently reports, most of these casualties have been caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as shelling from heavy artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes. My office is also documenting the devastating consequences of the conflict on other human rights. In areas around Kyiv from late February for about 5 weeks, Russian forces targeted male civilians who they considered suspicious. Men that were detained, beaten, summarily executed, and in some cases taken to Belarus and Russia, unbeknownst to their families and held in pretrial detention facilities. My staff met with families who are searching for their missing male relatives, desperate to know where they are, if they are alive, or how they can get them back. Families were shot as they tried to escape in convoys. In some areas, it was dangerous to cross the street with snipers or soldiers shooting at anyone who tried. Local authorities are compiling lists of deaths and missing, continuing exhumations, taking DNA from relatives, while also trying to reconnect districts to electricity and water. In other areas controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, such as Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, we continue to document arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearances of representatives of local authorities, journalists, civil society activists, retired servicemen, and the armed forces, and other civilians by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. As of 4th of May, my office has documented 180 such cases, of which 5 victims were eventually found dead. We have also documented 8 possible enforced disappearances of people considered to be pro-Russian in government-controlled territory. My staff heard about cases of women having been raped by Russian armed forces in areas that were under their control, as well as other allegations of sexual violence by both parties to the conflict. And yet, the stigma around rape and sexual violence continues to prevent victims and their families from feeling safe to report. This only highlights the importance of ensuring adequate and safe support services for victims. Grim evidence of torture, ill treatment, and summary executions of prisoners of war committed by both parties to the conflict is surfacing. My office is collecting such evidence, which will be included in its future reporting. The only way for these horrors to stop is for armed forces to fully respect their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. It is vital that all parties give clear instruction to their combatants to protect civilians and persons hors de combat, as well as to distinguish between civilian and military objects. Those in command of armed forces must make it clear to their members that anyone found to have been involved in such violations will be prosecuted and held accountable. Accountability demands that evidence be preserved and that mortal remains be treated with dignity, with decency. Madam President, members of the Council, the list of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law continues to grow each day, and we cannot let the number of victims continue to rise. A one-day ceasefire alone would spare the lives of at least 50 civilian children, women, and men, including many older persons. A one-day ceasefire would prevent 30 to 70 civilians from being injured and a dozen from becoming disabled. A one-day ceasefire would allow several thousand civilians to safely leave areas where they are currently trapped in hostilities. Most importantly, a ceasefire will show that the horror in Ukraine can be stopped. It is of the most fundamental importance that the ongoing hostilities cease once and for all. Madam President, advocating for accountability is a cornerstone of my office work. If the perpetrators of violations against civilians and persons hors de combat are brought to justice, potential perpetrators will think twice before unleashing similar unlawful attacks or acts of violence and creating new victims. Accountability also contributes to the healing process for the victims, the family, and the society at large. National justice systems are the most crucial. I urge the parties to the conflict to investigate all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law allegedly committed by the armed forces, and I welcome Ukraine's efforts in this regard. My office is fully committed to supporting those systems and the work of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and to cooperating with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and other international justice mechanisms in accordance with our established UN frameworks. Let us commit to putting a stop to this senseless conflict. We must be steadfast in our efforts for peace and resolute that justice will be done. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Bachelet for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Tatiana Lizan.
Thank you, Madam President. It is a great honor to represent today's civil society that mobilized the first hours after the full-scale Russian invasion of February 24, as they did before, for 8 years of the war. Our joint efforts are aimed at supporting brave Ukrainians, fighting at the forefront, as well as in public offices in Lviv, Kiev, and Kramatorsk. These are volunteers, municipal workers planting flowers in Kharkiv and other cities in Ukraine under heavy shelling, railway workers evacuating people away from hostilities and death, bakers, cashiers at groceries, and all people affected by the war. All Ukrainians are now beating as one big heart. In the chaos of war, no one should be left behind. People, their lives and health, honor, dignity, and security shall always remain the highest value. In order to maintain this goal, Ukraine and the whole civilized world shall face immense challenges caused by the military invasion of the Russian Federation. The war has been lasting for 8 years. In 2021, the number of IDPs in Ukraine fleeing occupied territories of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions officially was almost 1.5 million. At the end of April, the International Organization for Migration informed that the number of internally displaced persons as a result of the full-scale invasion of the territory of Ukraine reached 7.7 million. They all carried the same heavy burden of displacement. They all need equal protection. Also, should not be forgotten those Ukrainians who were forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation from Mariupol, Chernihiv, Severodonetsk, and other cities and villages. These people were forcibly displaced without documents and means of communication, exposed to the filtration by the Russian Federation. Within these 2 last months, over 1 million people overall, and around 200,000 children among them were forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation from Ukraine. It must be ensured that those who are willing to come back to Ukraine or travel to other countries have the possibility to do so. Challenges that children and their parents experience in the face of war are overwhelming. Right to Protection received calls via our hotline where parents were ready to send their children abroad with complete strangers, out of desperation because of the Russian atrocities happening in Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other cities. The world was shaken with stories of little boys, aged even 4 or 5, crossing the state border alone, or in the best case scenario with barely familiar people. Ukraine, as well as accepting countries, shall resume responsibility over these vulnerable little Ukrainians, so that the children are safely crossing the state borders, supported by specifically trained state guard officers and child service representatives. The accepting countries shall guarantee a high level of their protection. Family reunification should be presumed, and they are safe and timely return to Ukraine after the end of the war must be ensured. The number of killed and injured civilians is permanently increasing. The destinies of dozens of thousands of people in Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Irpin are unknown. Relatives cannot always prove the death of their beloved, even if they witnessed their last moments themselves. International community shall assist the government of Ukraine in establishing and enforcing appropriate measures of investigation and prosecution, since each life is priceless, and relatives deserve to know the truth. I want to mention those Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine seeking safety and security in the European Union and other countries in the civilized world. These Ukrainians, overwhelming majority women and children, should not be overlooked in terms of observance of their rights, shelter, human trafficking, access to service, including psychological help. Stateless persons and third country nationals who had previously found refuge in Ukraine shall be granted protection along with the Ukrainians. Finally, of paramount importance is to recall the immense number of IDPs, many of whom may not have a roof over their heads. In many cases, the conditions of temporary accommodation do not comply with basic rules of adequate shelter. IDPs live in collective or transit centers established in schools, places of common use, often not designed for stay during cold times. Over 32 million square meters of housing property were destroyed, damaged, or occupied. Despite the massive destruction, as the whole world has seen in Bucha, Irpin, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, thousands of civilians either returned back or never left their damaged homes. All of them urgently need adequate temporary or permanent accommodation, especially for the cold autumn and winter periods. Those who chose not to leave their damaged homes shall receive the much needed tangible support, such as the construction materials and tools, plastic wrap, and physical help. Additionally, such unprecedented massive destruction of civilian infrastructure requires durable solutions from the Ukrainian authorities with support of the international community. We call on all members of the Security Council, international organizations, and governments to support Ukrainians firmly in these dark times. In the name of millions of people who have died, unborn, survived residents of Ukraine, a UN member since 1945, we require to rephrase and breathe new sense in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. for living in peace. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Lausanne for her briefing. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and may I start by congratulating the UK presidency for their excellent stewardship of the Council during the month of April, and wish you, Madam President and dear Linda, as well as the US team, the very best